on this computer, and I am switching. There we are. Okay. Okay, and all right. So it is chapter 12. Something we started last lecture, last Thursday. US banking system. Okay, we talked about the central bank stepping up and managing the money and the banking system. We talked about different monetary aggregates, how to measure the money. Of course, you have to measure it first to know how much you have, and then go ahead and manage it, right? We also talked about safety regulations, what the US central bank does, what regulations are put in place. So we, just regular consumers, you, your parents, your family, your friends, I, my parents, my family, we all feel safe, okay, to put our extra cash into a commercial bank. And those regulations, okay, I'm going to take a small step back. Safety regulations. Okay, and those regulations, we talked about deposit insurance, right? Okay, all national banks must buy deposit insurance. State banks may choose to, they have a choice. So what you're looking for when you walk into an unknown bank, you're looking for a plaque that says insured by FDIC. And FDIC stands for Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Okay. If you see this plaque, if you know that the bank you are dealing with insures every deposit, then it doesn't matter whether it's a state bank or a national bank. The deposit insurance guarantees your money will be safe. Okay. Another measure to keep commercial banks straight, not to get engaged into risky activity with our money, is continuous supervision. About once every month, somebody from the central bank comes down to check on how regular commercial banks handle daily transactions. Okay. And another important regulation, something that we're going to talk about till the rest of the class today, in chapter 12 at least, is reserve requirements. Okay, reserve requirements. This is where we stopped on Thursday. Okay, what are these reserve requirements? Reserve requirements are set for every commercial bank, no matter how small, no matter whether it's a state bank or national bank. Every commercial bank that deals with customers gets its own required reserve ratio, RRR. Every commercial bank gets its own required reserve ratio set by the US central bank. Every commercial bank, okay? What is it for? How does it work? Here, let's run an example. Okay, let's say you received a graduation gift. Your grandmother or aunt or whoever else sends you a $1,000 check. Okay, well, you will be moving on with your life. You need nice clothes to go to interviews, probably a better computer, whatever. Okay, you're holding a check. Pay to the order, John Brown, $1,000. Okay, what do we all do with the checks? Okay, we take them to the bank. We deposit it first while we're contemplating how best we can spend the money, right? So a deposit of $1,000 comes in. You just deposited the check, you're walking back home, driving back home, and thinking, oh, I have an extra cash that will help me to do this. While you're running your other errands, the money is sitting in the bank. What happens with this deposit? Okay, let's say the bank that you are banking with has a required reserve ratio of 20%. Okay, what does it mean? That means the entire deposit that you just brought to the bank will be split into required reserves and excess reserves. We're going to call them RR, and excess reserves, ER. Okay, the entire deposit. In what proportion? Based on the required reserve ratio. So required reserves calculated as the required reserve ratio times the deposit. In our example, the required reserve portion of $1,000 deposit would be 20% times $1,000. That gives us, that's right, $200. So out of $1,000 deposit just came in, required reserves will be 200. Okay, let me make sure that I give you the right number. So 1,000 times 0.2, that's right, 200, right? The reason this portion is called required reserves, this portion of deposit, of your deposit, or any deposit for that matter, is required to stay with the bank and not go anywhere. Okay, so it will be sent down to the bank's vault. Okay, there. 20% out of your deposit will be flushed down to the bank's basement, to its vault, and stay there until you're back to withdraw the money. Okay? And that required reserves are calculated based on the required reserve ratio. So the ratio, whether it's 10%, 50%, tells the bank which part out of every deposit must be kept in the bank's basement, right? So, but this is only a part of the deposit, right? It's only $200, but you brought 1,000. Everything on top of the required reserves are called excess reserves. So excess reserves are deposits minus the required reserves. So in our example, the $1,000 minus 200 and excess reserves are 800. Okay, excess reserves, the second part of the deposit. What does it mean? Okay, that means every deposit will be broken this way. Out of every deposit, a portion will be kept in the bank's basement until the original depositor comes back to withdraw the money. Okay, once the required reserves satisfied everything else, the remaining part of the deposit will be called excess reserves. Okay, so we flushed the required reserve part, 20% of $1,000 down to the bank's basement. Okay, no, there is nothing else to discuss about that. Let's look at the remaining part of the deposit, something that we called excess reserves, right? What happens with that money? Bank is not required to keep this money. That's why they called excess reserves. Let's for a moment think of what banks do for us. Okay, they help to keep our money safe, but also think every time you needed extra cash, you needed a loan to finance a purchase, where do you go? To the bank that you bank with, exactly. But we also know banks do not print the money. So when you ask for a loan, where would that money come from? Okay, that's the answer. So here is a story. Every dollar that the commercial bank considers to be excess reserve will be used into a future loan. So let's say with the bank settled your $1,000 deposit, you're happily home, you know that your money are safe. The $200 as required reserves are down in the bank's basement, but the rest, 800, sitting in the cashier's machine and doing nothing. And there I walk in and I ask for just a tiny over loan, just, till the next paycheck, just about maybe $800. Can you lend me $800? And the bank says, sure, of course we can lend you $800. We just got excess reserves in $800. We can't let this money simply sit and do nothing. We can lend it to Professor Melkumin and earn some interest rate, okay? So the bank takes $800 as excess reserves from your deposit and issues a loan to me. Now, how does a bank issue a loan? Okay, they could give me a check, right? That first I'm going to deposit. Or what's more, if I am banking with this bank, they will simply deposit that loan on my checking account, right? However, are we going to go about issuing this loan? Give me a check, I deposit it first, or they deposit on my checking account. The next step for this money is to become a deposit. Okay? Let's say they cut me a check. Okay? Well, I was fill out the paper for time over loan. They said, here, take this check. I take this check. Of course, I'm not going to cash that. I'm not going to carry $800 in my pocket. That is extremely not healthy. I'm going to put this money on my checking account, a deposit, and I'm going to think how I'm going to spend it. Okay, a deposit of $800. What did we say happens to every deposit when it comes in? Yes, any deposit will be split into the required reserves and excess reserves. Let's keep the required reserve ratio at 20% for all our calculations for all our deposits, okay? So the required reserves, we know is the required reserve ratio times the deposit, or 20% times 800, and out of my deposit, we're looking at 160, okay? Is it correct? Yeah. No. Yes. 160, okay? As I deposit $800, as I deposit the loan, that becomes a deposit. $160 is going to go to bank's vault and stay there until I'm back to take the money, okay? But $160 is not the entire deposit I made. So the excess reserves is deposit minus required reserves. And excess reserves will be 800 minus 160, and it will become 640, right? Out of my $800 deposit, 160 goes down into the bank's basement and stay there, bank's vault. But 640, the excess reserve part, stays atop in a cashier's machine and just sitting there doing nothing until someone else comes in and asks for a loan, right? An excess reserve part of my deposit becomes a loan to somebody else. And the loan is handled the first and foremost, okay? Whether it was a check or a deposit on somebody else's account, it becomes a deposit, okay? A deposit that will be split into the required reserves and the excess reserves, okay? Let's calculate the required reserve part of 640 with the same 20%, 128, and excess reserves minus 640, 512. Required reserve part goes down into the bank's vault. Excess reserve part of the deposit becomes a loan or part of the loan to somebody else. And before anything happens to the loan, it will be first deposited. What happens to a deposit when it comes into the banking system? That's right. It will be split in excess reserves and required reserves. Okay? All right? Let me take you, of course, the rolling of the depositing, splitting, lending excess reserves, depositing, splitting, lending excess reserves doesn't stop right here. But let me take you back to the very beginning of our exercise. Okay? Where is the beginning? Here. A deposit of $1,000 first created a deposit of $800, then created a deposit of $640, then created a deposit of $512. And it all and we're not even done with all these layers. Doesn't it remind you of something? Anybody? We're going through layers. Does it remind you of something? We talk about doing extra spending, delivering extra income. That extra income will spur additional extra spending that will deliver additional extra income that will start another spending. We see the same layers here. A deposit starts the multiple deposit creation process, which is called the money multiplier process. Okay, what we're observing here is a multiple deposit creation by bank through lending out excess reserves. Okay, look what happens first. The original excess reserves of $800 created a deposit of $800. The second round excess reserves of $640 created a deposit of $640. That deposit created a loan and subsequent deposit of $512. Okay. Okay. What we're seeing, what we are seeing here is how banks by lending excess reserves, right? Because it's the excess reserve part of deposit that's being lent out. By lending excess reserves, how banks create deposits. But remember what we said, deposits, checkable accounts, are part of M1 monetary aggregate, which is part of money supply. So banks, by lending out excess reserves, creating the money supply. By lending out excess reserves, creating money supply through creation of deposits. Okay, all right. Remember last time we said a bank basic operation is asset transformation. Banks transfer deposits into loans. That's exactly how it's done. Every time a deposit comes in, it will be split into excess reserves and required reserves. Required reserves stays with the bank. Excess reserves will be lent out on its own or will be part of a larger loan that will also be lent out on its own. Okay? So this is what people mean when they say banks use excess reserves to create money, because money supply is money, right? Deposits are money. Banks use excess reserves to create money. So the question is always, what would be the final impact? How much more of money supply, how much more of deposits will be created when we go through all these layers: depositing, splitting, lending out excess reserves, depositing, splitting, lending out excess reserves? How much in money supply increase we will observe? Well, okay. Final change in money supply, okay? Initial change in deposits times the money multiplier, okay? So in our example, the banking system saw an inflow of the deposit. A deposit came in. Came into the banking system. That's why I put a plus. A deposit came in. There is more money in the banking system. Okay. Now, the money multiplier is 1 over the required reserve ratio. If our ratio is 20%, then the money multiplier would be 1 over 0.25, right? Let's make sure I give you the right numbers. That's right. Okay. So the final change would be times 5. We will see an increase by $5,000 in money supply when a deposit of $1,000 comes in and the required reserve ratio is 20%. Okay. An increase in money supply by $5,000 will result in a deposit of $1,000 and the required reserve ratio of 20%. Okay. Any questions? No? Okay. So now, with our original deposit, right? You brought in $1,000. Down there in the basement, 200 are sitting down there waiting for you. The excess reserve part of $800 was lent out, gone, okay? You come in. Let me. And you ask the cashier to get your $1,000 back. You know how you're going to spend it. You're ready. You're ready to get the money. Okay. So you're standing. Well, of course, no ATM is going to cash out that much money, right? So you have to go inside and present a withdrawal slip or just ask the cashier to give you $1,000 back. Okay. Here. For the bank, out of the $1,000 you brought in yesterday or a couple of days ago, only 200 are sitting in the bank in the basement. Only that much is available. Okay. 800 out of your deposit were lent out, they're gone. Right? Now let me ask you this. Have you ever been denied a withdrawal from your checking account where you knew there was plenty of money? Anybody? Anybody has ever been turned down by a cashier?
Yes,
Really?
I think so, but I don't remember.
Really? You had money on your checking account and you were turned down saying, no, we cannot give you cash.
Yeah, but I ended up getting cash.
Well, I have never run into such an experience. If you have money on your checking account, I cannot see how bank is going to deny your withdrawal. Okay, so let's go back to our example. So you're standing in front of a cashier and ask for $1,000 that you deposited a couple of days ago. And the cashier says, yeah, give me a moment. Okay. We know that only $200 are actually available. But to say to you, no, your account is empty, it's like saying to you, I really don't know how to manage your money, right? Go to somebody else's bank. Of course, they're not going to say that. They're going to go down to the basement, take the $200 from the vault, and find the $800 to give it to you back as $1,000. This comes from the required reserves of your deposit from the bank vault, okay? This extra $800 that is not actually present because they were lent out will come from, very good, other required reserves deposits, okay? From other required reserve deposits. So you take $1,000 and you walk out happily, okay? The bank now, after your transactions, has a hole of $800 in required reserves. Well, remember, one of the regulations to keep the bank straight is required reserves. There is a certain amount based on their deposits the bank must keep on their hands. If that amount does not correspond to the proper amount, the bank is going to be in trouble, right? 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 So what the bank will do, the first thing, the most important thing, fill out that hole, okay? They're going to use every deposit that's coming in. And when you consider a commercial bank on a daily basis, there is a ton of different deposits coming in, okay? The bank's priority will be to replenish the required reserves that were used to pay your original deposit out, okay? So they're waiting for every deposit to take it and throw into required reserves. And here I walk in and ask for a loan. What kind of answer am I going to get? No. Well, they're not going to say that. No, they're going to say, here is the paperwork, fill out the paperwork, come tomorrow, right? But today, they will be working very hard to fill out that hole of $800. No loans will be issued until that $800 are put in place to follow the regulation. No loans. Okay. No loans. If I don't get that loan, I'm not going to make a deposit. The deposit will not be split into the required and excess reserves. Excess reserves will not be lent out, will not be creating new deposits that will not be split between excess and required reserves. No loans means no future deposits. No future deposits means no future loans. No future loans means no future deposits, and so on, and so on, and so on. What are we looking at as the reverse of the money multiplier? Every time there is a withdrawal, the money multiplier is going to start working in reverse. Okay, so $1,000 withdrawal, that's why we put the minus in, times money multiplier will create, which is 1 over the required reserve ratio, 1 over 0.25 minus will create a drop in money supply by $5,000. Okay. So again, the money multiplier principle, the multiple deposit creation principle, is just a concept. If a deposit comes in, the money multiplier starts working, multiplying the cash in the economy. If a deposit is taken out of the banking system, a withdrawal, we will see at a decrease in money supply. Okay, so let us clearly state these two important conclusions. A deposit, single, a deposit comes in, it will increase excess reserves, increase banks' ability to lend, okay, will expand the money supply. A withdrawal, on the other hand, will reduce the volume of excess reserves and restrict banks' ability to lend, and will start the money multiplier in reverse, contracting the money supply. Okay. 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 Any questions? No? All right. So that is the end of chapter 12, and we are moving to our last chapter, chapter 13, monetary policies. And those are the steps taken by the U.S. Central Bank. Okay, so just gonna go a little bit, a very short overview. U.S. Central Bank. The banking system that you observe and participate in today, it hasn't been there forever, okay? When we were talking about safety regulations, we said all the banks will have required reserve ratio, right? All the banks will be supervised. All national banks required to buy the deposit insurance. Why? Because every bank is a part of the US centralized banking system, okay? But if we're going back into 1600s and 1700s, what you will see, privately owned banks, okay? Banks that were managed by individuals, and because they were privately owned by different individuals, every bank will have its own currency. Yeah, bank in Macomb will have one type of currency. Banks in Chicago will have other type of currency. Imagine traveling through country and your wallet is stuffed with different type of currencies. And of course, if you live in Macomb and going up to Chicago to buy stuff or just spend a good time, you can't, your Macomb currency will be completely useless. Nobody's going to accept Macomb currency. What are they going to do with it, right? So the difficulties with privately owned banks Having different currencies for every bank was a nightmare, especially for merchants. Imagine that, right? Second of all, there was no regulations, there was no safety features. There was so much of bank abuse in second part of 1800, so much of bank abuse. You can step out on the street one day, see a big sign that says Bank of Toronto or Bank of Macomb, come and deposit your money, look at the interest rate we're offering. You come out the very next day, the building is empty, no sign, no anything. Bank abuse, right? Because banks are not answering to anyone. No one is supervising them. So for quite a while, I would say about 2,500 years, it was quite devastating for the economy, right? Then in 1917, oh yes, from 1850, because of such instability, difference in currency, no supervision, from 1850 we would have a regular banks panics. Okay, banks go bankrupt, people gonna lose their money. 1850, 1870, 1890, and after 1890 we would have banks panic almost every 5 years. So by the time we hit 1917, right, I'm sorry, 1913, the government, US government, was so fed up with such a disorganized banking system, not even banking system, with such disorganized monetary state of the economy, that they decided, okay, we're done. We're so done. First of all, if we're a united country, every banks, every bank in the country must have the same currency. Okay, Federal Reserve Act. In 1913, through the action of US Treasury Alexander Hamilton, okay, the Federal Reserve Act was developed and approved, an act through which all the states, all the US states were broken into Federal Reserve districts with one main district as a head that supervises the rest of the banks. Okay. All banks must either turn into national charter or and therefore respond and be checked by the main central bank, or the state charter where they are supervised and answer to state authority. Therefore, the dual banking system, national and state banks. Okay. So through the Federal Reserve Act, US central bank was established. Okay. We ended up with 12 Federal Reserve districts with one main bank per a district. Okay, so we have 12 Federal Reserve districts, one main bank per district. That main bank supervises all the rest of the commercial banks in its own district, making sure all banks have the same currency. Okay, so if you travel through country from New Jersey to California, you have the same legal tender. Okay, the paper money with presidents on them, right? So wherever you're coming from, as long as it's the US, you can possess the same purchasing power wherever you are. Okay, so 12 main federal district banks is what comprises US central bank. 12 main Federal Reserve district banks is the US central bank. Interesting, isn't it? We don't really have one physically central bank, we have 12. So every time when somebody says US central bank, that person knowingly or unknowingly refers to the 12 main Federal Reserve District banks. Okay, right? So the entire nation, all states were broken into districts, Federal Reserve Districts. Federal because it's a federal system. Reserves, the system was based on reserves, required reserves and excess reserves. Okay? So to cut the long name short, the US Central Bank, commonly now, is called the Fed. And that's how we're going to call it. Okay? So every time you are in conversation or listening to a conversation that discusses the Fed's policy in terms of money supply, they're not talking about the FBI or the federal government. They're talking about the US Central Bank, current steps and current policies, the Fed as the US Central Bank. Okay? So the Fed, okay, so what the Fed does, it affects the economy through availability of external funds. Okay. Remember, the Fed supervises, manages the banking system, and banks are the places where we go when we need extra cash, external funds, loans. Okay, there are times when it's very easy to get a loan, and there are times when it's extremely hard to get one. Who manages the system? Who makes it harder or easier to get these loans? The Fed. Okay, and that's exactly what we will be discussing in this chapter. So, the tools the Fed uses to manage the money supply. Okay. First, open market operations. Second, discount lending. And the third, reserve requirements. Okay, the three tools. So we're going to work with every tool, understanding how exactly it works, how the Fed uses the tool, why, for what reason. And then we're just going to bring in back our income expenditure diagram and aggregate demand, aggregate supply diagram to simulate different policies. Okay. Open market operations. Open market operations. I'm going to abbreviate open market operations to OMO. So tool number one, open market operations. Open market operations are the actions of the Fed of buying or selling treasury bills. Buys or sells treasury bills. Okay. A treasury bill is a bond issued by the US government. Okay, treasury bill is a promissory note, okay, or a bond, if you will. You buy a treasury bill, you give your money to the government. A treasury bill is a bond with an expiration time in 3, 6, 9, and 12 months. By the time that bill expires, you get $1,000 from the government. Why would the government do that? to raise money. That's how the government borrows the money, okay? It issues treasury bills on a continuous order. Who buys those treasury bills? Anyone who wants to invest, anyone who wants to lend his or her money to the government. Treasury bills. We buy them as an investment instrument. Okay? We buy T-bills, say at $900, and at maturity, the expiration time, at maturity, T-bills, the T-bill pays us $1,000, right? We invest 900, we get back 1,000, $100 of clean profit and investment profit. That's why people buy treasury bills. Okay. The thing about treasury bills is they are very liquid. Everybody knows treasury bills. They're very easy to buy and sell, and they're very short-term bills. Okay. Plus, we will always have a government who will buy those treasury bills back. So people like you and me, banks, the Fed, buy and hold treasury bills for investment purposes. Buy and hold T-bills for investment purposes. Okay? Okay? You buy a bill, you hold it until it matures, you get $1,000 back, right? So at any given point in time, we have a large numbers of treasury bills that are held by the population and by the Fed, investment portfolios, okay? So here we have the Fed and population holding T-bills for investment purposes, holding T-bills for investment purposes, investments, okay? Right? When the Fed conducts an open market purchase of T-bills, okay, it says to the population, listen, your T-bills expire in a month. Why wait that long? Sell them to me right now. I'll give you $1,000 right now so you can reinvest more, okay? Through an open market purchase, the Fed says to the population, sell me your T-bills. Let me write it nicely. Well, you know, it's a regular transactions after all. You sell something that belongs to you, you get money instead. Okay? Through open market purchase, the Fed buys treasury bills that the general public are currently holding. If you sell some of the treasury bills to the Fed, you will get a check in mail, okay, saying, pay to the order, Professor Melkumen, the amount of, say, $5,000, okay? What do I do with my check? Deposits, start the money multiplier process. And the result of which will be an expansion in money supply, right? So through open market purchases, the Fed takes away those piece of paper that says T-bill on it and gives us cash instead. So people with their pockets full of cash gonna go ahead and spend, okay? More money on our deposits. Okay, banks have more money through their excess reserve explosion, so it's easier to find a loan. So we go ahead and spend. We spend what we just released from the holding T-bills. Plus, it's easier to get a loan, so we do so, driving the consumption up and driving the aggregate demand up. Okay. So the Fed cannot directly affect the aggregate demand, but it can create a great incentive flushing the cash into the economy through the deposits, through the population, or if the Fed buys those treasury bills from banks, it just flushes the money as excess reserves, saying to banks, go ahead and start lending. Make it easier for people to get loans because we want to see an increase in spending. Okay? Open market purchases of T-bills by the Fed increases the cash into the economy, right? Now, the Fed holding T-bills, so let us look at an open market sale. Investment portfolio, and here we have population holding T-bills, investments, all for the purpose of investments, okay? Through open market sales of T-bills. Now, this time, the Fed says, okay, listen, I know you just bought T-bills from the government at $900. What if I offer you more T-bills at $800? Remember, at the maturity, you get $1,000. You can earn more if you buy those T-bills from me. And open market sales, the Fed sells T-bills to the population, but sale, if you're buying something, whether it's a loaf of bread or a treasury bill, you have to pay for it. Okay. So as the population buy treasury bills from the Fed, it takes cash. The Fed say, don't send me cash, send me checks. Okay. So you pull out your checkbook and you write a check. Pay to the owner of the Federal Reserve $5,000. Okay. The Fed takes a check, cashes it against your checkable accounts, and we have a withdrawal. Okay. Increase in withdrawals, okay, will reduce banks' excess reserves, will reduce banks' ability to issue loans, and will start the money multiplier in reverse. Will start the money multiplier in reverse, resulting in a contraction of money supply. Okay, so look what happens. You are buying something from the Fed. I mean, you're expanding your investment portfolio. That's great. You're going to earn more money when those treasury bills mature or expire. But for now, you just took some chunk of money out of a checking account. You can spend that money. They're gone. Okay. So withdrawals restrict our spending power. We can't spend what we just saved, right? And as a result, we're looking at a lower consumption and lower demand. So again, through these examples, what do you see? You see that the Fed is taking the steps of reducing the volume of cash available for the population to spend, restricting. And if banks have fewer excess reserves, it's harder to get a loan. So look, we have the population have fewer dollars to spend, and it's harder to get a loan. Of course, we're not going to spend. Of course, we're going to spend less than before. So consumption drops and aggregate demand drops. Okay. Okay. Let us stop right here. Okay. We still have discount lending, required reserves. Then we're going to introduce the money market and then simulation of monetary policies. But that is all for our next lecture. Right? Are there any questions? No questions? Okay, I am going to stop recording.